Hello and welcome everyone. Apologies for our technical glitches, but we're all here and ready for the fourth installment of the Center for the Study of Arab and Muslim Worlds 2024 Witnessing Genocide in Palestine film series. Today we have a really amazing documentary by Ilan Ziv, which focuses on the outbreak of the Second Intifada, Intifada al-Aqsa, which extended from year 2000 to 2005. This film plays an important role in our historical chronology of the conflict, of the ethnic cleansing and violence and oppression that has been unleashed on the Palestinians by Zionism since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. This film, in terms of the historical coverage, focuses on the period of Oslo, which essentially 1993 picks up from where we left off with the last film, and carries it forward to the period really in the middle of the Second Al-Aqsa Intifada. This film, I believe, is very powerful, and I use it as a teaching tool and have been for the last 20 years because it very effectively and powerfully illustrates the suffering, the pain, and the loss really on both sides of this conflict. And so it's also, I believe, relevant historically in terms of it documenting a particular period in the conflict and, if you will, the peace process, and that is the realization for those of us who were following closely the peace process and the potential for a two-state solution, really the realization that that peace process had essentially come to an end, sadly. And in that context, the violence that was unleashed in the Second Intifada took the conflict to a new level, both because of the Zionist onslaught on the West Bank and on Gaza, but also because of the form of resistance that was employed by Palestinians during this second uprising. So it fills a very important gap, and also I think a gap in terms of a focus on this period of the conflict that truly reflects the loss and the suffering and the destruction that was experienced by families on both sides of this conflict. So in that, I feel that it's just one of the most critical films in this chronological film series. So with that, I look forward to a Q&A after. If people have questions, please enter them into the Q&A. I'm joined today by my dear colleague, Dr. Danny Doueri, who will also be discussant for the Q&A portion. And before we run the film, I'm going to turn it over to Danny for the CSUSB land statement.
Thank you, dear David. And I just wanted to also note that our very dear also Professor Ahlam Muhtasib is also joining us also as a panelist. I just saw her name walking in. So welcome, everyone. The acknowledgement which we hold so dear to our hearts. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, Yuha Aviatan. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty, and we will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and indigenous people. Thank you so much, and we look forward for a fruitful education and very informational film today, followed by discussion.
Okay, we are back. We will take questions in the Q&A and also responses from our discussants. Dr. Muhtaseb has joined us. I just want to add a little bit of historical background that I neglected to add at the beginning that would be relevant for those who aren't familiar with the history of the conflict. But after the 1967 war, Israel began its illegal settlement activity in the Gaza Strip, and those Israeli settlers were occupying prime portions of the Gaza Strip until the, as it was called, the unilateral disengagement in 2005, at which point the Gaza Strip basically became the world's largest open-air prison and essentially a concentration camp. So the featuring in this film of settlers in Gaza might be something that those who do not have the historical background might not have understood. I think it's important to note as well that this is a large part of the effort right now in the vast destruction of Gaza, huge swaths of the territory, to enable future settlement by Zionist colonialists. And so potentially the Nezarim Junction, which has been laid waste time and time again since this film was made, will potentially be the future site of ongoing conflict, unfortunately. So I'll just add one general observation about this film. One of the reasons that I really value it as a historian is that it features the Israeli generation that was supportive of the two-state solution, of the peace process, and really the dissolution of that peace process, and therefore illustrating the process by which all hope was lost in that process. And however naively many of us did value that process and the specter of potentially a two-state solution as you know, a better option than ongoing occupation and violence. And so I often wonder, where are these people now? Because we do not hear anything really anymore of any form of Israeli peace bloc, Israeli left, even generally the two-state solution. I'm guessing these people are still living in Israel, but they have no voice whatsoever. And relative to the, I think, powerful testimony of Israeli parents expressing the absurdity of the occupation and the death of their children, I've just often wondered over the years, using this film as a teaching tool, where they are and what they're thinking, as well as, of course, Fahmi's family, his mother, his sisters, his uncle. Where are they? Are they even alive right now? So I think it's a powerful film, complex film, certainly open to debate relative to what it chose to emphasize, but I nevertheless, over the years, have found it to be increasingly important in illustrating this specific period of the conflict, and that is the dissolution of the Oslo peace process through to the Second Al-Aqsa Intifada. So that's sort of the totality of my comments. I'll look in the QA. We do not yet have any comments or questions, so I know that my colleagues would like to share their feelings about the film, and so I'll turn it over to you.
Dr. Dwayne, do you want to go first?
Go ahead. I'm sure we're going to get many questions. I'll let you go. This is something that is very dear to our heart. But on top of it, there's your family who come from there. They are the ones who are dying on a daily basis. And I cannot imagine the agony of daily occupation and almost now century-long occupation of all of that land. After all, Gaza was not only occupied a year. These people were refugees because of the loss of their own land, which was right across, could be a few hundred meters. So these are second time, third time, fourth time, fifth time refugees. So I'll let you take the lead on it.
Thank you very much. Thank you both, actually, Dr. Dwayne and Dr. Yagobian, for continuing the series and the conversations. I think they are very essential and important for, you know, understanding the important narratives around the so-called conflict. I think I'm going to be addressing this both as you said, you know, as a Palestinian who lived through all these events up until I had to immigrate to the United States in 1998. I lived through the first Intifada. I was the discussant of the Intifada, Naila and the Intifada film And I guess I talked about my experience, probably not many people were here, but also as a critical media, post-colonial, media critic. And I think I see things sometimes very differently, also having done this for years and years. Of course, in every film, and almost in every film, there is value. And I absolutely agree with you, Dr. Yagobian, that there is some value in looking at the Israeli psyche. But I guess I've never watched the film before today. And it might be one of the reasons is that I never trust an Israeli filmmaker to make an honest representation of us, Palestinians in a film. I'm always disappointed. I've seen so many Israeli films or joint, Israeli-Palestinian films. And as a media scholar, I always ask about, of course, the political economy of production, who's producing, who's making the film makes all the difference, of course. Sometimes it's the filmmaker, sometimes it's the production money, and sometimes it's both. And in this case, I think it's both, because we saw in the credits that it was supported greatly by the Israeli government. I mean, Israeli funding sources, and usually they come mainly from the government. So my issue is that I felt the film followed the typical stereotypical representations of Palestinians and Israelis. And it takes a very similar, although the historical context is very different, right, from what we are seeing now in terms of the genocide, but it still takes the same typical line of the Israelis are in self-defense mode. The filmmakers went out of their way to humanize the Israeli soldiers and even romanticize them, which reminds me greatly with the representation of the hostages that we have seen, especially after October 7. You see their parents up close, you see their hobbies, you see them dancing, singing, having, fun conversations. Their friends talk about them endlessly. You know everything about their surroundings. And in a way, you feel this deep, deep empathy with soldiers. At the end of the day, they are soldiers in an occupying, colonizing force. On the other hand, the film did not even bother to show their violence in the process of humanizing them. And that's a very crucial missing part of the film. You never see them shoot, you never see them do the things that I grew up seeing. I was shot at age 16, as I said, in a violent demonstration on International Women's Day. We were doing nothing except holding signs and standing in the street. And they shot several of us, including me, in my arm. And that's just nothing compared to other forms of violence that I have grown up to see. We don't see this in the film. And that's a very important missing context. The historical context is missing. Identifying the colonizer and the colonized, treating them as if they somehow equal sides, fighting a war, like any other war, also missing. There were important conversations at the end, I agree, but a lot is missing in this film. And it does so much harm to people like me seeing it. It's so painful to watch it. So the romanticization of soldiers and their families and their stories, not only romanticization, but as a filmmaker myself, who was involved in the editing process so many times now, I know that the editing process is a very intentional one. Every single shot, when we edited, for example, 1948 Creation Catastrophe, at the end, we were down to literally edit, down to frames. Like we'd say, oh, there is a pause here, we can take it out. So knowing the intentionality and the editing process, there was so much room for talking about the Israeli soldiers and their families and centering their stories. And the same was not given to the Palestinians. Also, the way they were shown, they were represented, while they were presented as very rational, as, kids that any American young person would identify with and feel their pain and feel they are represented in those stories. That was not done to the Palestinians. If anything, yes, we probably identify a little bit with the mother, But in general, the Palestinians were shown as those irrational mobs attacking for some wild reason that we don't know, those poor Israeli soldiers stranded in towers. I mean, this is just, I'm so sorry, to being cynical, but very ridiculous, knowing how much was omitted from those scenes.
I must ask, though, did you watch the portion where Fahmi's friend was explaining what happened during the First Intifada, and they showed the violence that you mentioned, and they showed Israeli soldiers shooting at Palestinians? They featured the First Intifada. That's when his friend, humanizing him, talked about how he liked green oranges because they really hit hard and hurt. That was humanizing. I felt that that was important. That was complex, and that also did cover the violence that you said was absent completely from the documentary. In fact, that violence was not absent, and I thought they had very powerful testimony from Palestinians explaining how the Israeli violence ends up harming everyone's values. I thought that that was very complex, and I don't agree that the violence of the occupation was just not shown and that the entire effort was just to glorify these Israeli soldiers. It certainly emphasizes their narrative, and I see that as problematic. I knew it would bother you, but yet this is the real complex history of this conflict. And so I don't know what purpose a documentary would serve that just completely ignored the Israelis, and especially this generation of Israelis who were supportive of the peace process.
Can I please continue, and then
Sure.
please go ahead, after I finish, I value your opinion and you can continue with that. But to respond quickly to what you just said, they could have shown actually the violence from the Israeli side clearly when those young men were attacking the tower. They did not show that. And I think that's a very important parallel. And also, Dr. Yagobian, you are a professor of the history of the conflict. You're specialized. That's your specialty. You spent years and years studying and understanding. When I do this analysis, of course, when I watch it, I know what's going on, and I don't need someone to tell me that. But I always have the audience in mind. Audience who don't know anything, or maybe a little bit about the conflict, or totally, misunderstand. And I've done this research. I've actually tested, I always do it, media passages or media clips with my students and, my participants, and collect their feedback. And most of the time, if things are not clarified, they get confused about who is the evil people doing this to the soldiers. So I talk also from experience as a scholar who did this over and over. And in that particular sense, they could have easily shown the violence of the soldiers. They showed them as barricading, hiding, and then they had to call the helicopters and shell those Palestinians. So that's the context how they showed it. I think it's very important that, those poor soldiers, we were calling and we were, in distress, and then they sent the helicopters, and the helicopters ended up shelling and shooting the people who were demonstrating. There was also an issue with the translation. For example, and that's, I think, what hyping up this image of the crazy Palestinians without really giving very clear explanation of what was going on. Again, me and you and Dr. Dweri, we know this very well. We know what was happening. We know the visit. They showed the clip, for example, of the visit of Sharon to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but they didn't really explain everything that happened, It's way more than what they showed. And again, for an audience that doesn't know much, they wouldn't understand it. So, for example, when the woman who was living in the apartment who filmed some of the clips they showed said, everyone came and said, my cousin is a shaheed, my relative is a shaheed. They translated shaheed, they used the word shaheed, they didn't use the word martyr. And I think it's very important that they should have translated that, because they did in other contexts, to explain the violence that motivated those actions. Without understanding that, then it becomes like a crazy mob that wants to just climb those walls and attack the soldiers. Of course, they did. I'm not going to be unfair to them, because they did show, of course, some of the violence against Palestinians and the fact that they were unarmed, etc. But again, building the narrative is very crucial when you give voices to soldiers saying, we were stranded, we didn't know what to do. It sounded crazy when they hit the, well, you're saying that you have this fence that is not going to allow anything to pass through. They don't have rockets, they don't have firearms, they had only rocks, or as you said, oranges in the First Intifada. I guess also the ending with the Israeli parents expressing their views versus Palestinians for, again, an American audience. Israeli parents were very rational. They, as you said, explained things in a very rational way. They rejected the death of their kids. But Palestinians, the mother and the daughter, were shown only as religiously citing, like they were religious fanatics, saying it's okay if their children died. And that goes into, again, within this narrative that we hear over and over, we hear it from many personalities in the United States and Europe, that Palestinians don't love their kids. This comes, for me, immediately came very, very clear. It was not a no one's sophisticated analysis of how Palestinians cope through religion. That would have been different. I would have been fine with that. But it came like, without that important context, cultural context, a Palestinian filmmaker would have presented that in a beautiful way. You have something unimaginable, violence that you cannot control. You have no control over it, and you are pushed to it every day. And then where your kid resort to the extreme measures of helplessness, right? How do you cope with that? And these are the things that Palestinians found over the years, and that resurfaced now during genocide, when people have discourse over that. How can they live with that? How they can cope? And I think this is one of the most important mechanisms of coping with their losses, not grieve loss of a child only, but losses over and over and over. And I don't think the film was able to capture that. On the contrary, when they show the settlers, for example, they don't show the madness, fanatic, ideologies behind the settlers. Why are they there? We see the settlers sitting in a bus and going with the soldiers, being protecting with the soldiers. But people don't, again, an average audience, not you and me and Dr. Dweri, see that, they think, oh my God, those soldiers are protecting this poor settler. And the word settler, that's another conversation. And look at those Palestinians, ambushing them and blowing them to pieces. It fits perfectly with the same old narrative. Even like the Jewish ceremony at the end, it's cut, but the Palestinian one is not cut. I look at all these little details because cumulatively they make a difference in the narrative that is being presented. I think the good thing about at the end is I like how this young woman with her very simple words was able, yes, to manage to get a very important message at the end. And you're absolutely right about wondering, where are those people they stand after the genocide, right? And after this extreme transformation of the Israeli society to the very right, extreme right of politics. But thank you for your patience with me. But, I had to pick those points up because I think they are very important to be pointed out, especially from someone who lived those experiences and the way I see them presented. And I'm sure many Palestinians would feel the same way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Luckily, we have a film series and specialists to talk about the complexities. So I'm not, this film was not shown as the only film to explain Gaza and the genocide and Zionism and Palestinians, thankfully. We have two comments here. I'll read them. They were in the Q&A. We have the first, this is another great film. Thank you for sharing this. I think the key aspect is shared sufferings and humanity in terms of representation. I was troubled by too many references to martyrdom, not the struggle to end occupation. And then another, agree with Dr. Mutaseb, the images of Israeli soldiers now I see do not match the images of Israeli soldiers shown in the film. I would just address that and say this isn't about the current Israeli soldiers. This is about what was going on at the time in the history of this conflict. And I don't think that we're all going to be able to identify a documentary that itself encapsulates everything that we have witnessed and that we know and that we are experiencing and crying about daily. This is about the history of the conflict, and therefore I'm just going to say again, despite its problematics, I feel that it was a much more complex and nuanced portrayal than my colleague feels that it is. And so we always agree to disagree about these things. And furthermore, I feel like certainly if one has a laser focus on what is being stereotyped and how, one can pick and choose throughout this film and say, well, why did they say that? And why didn't they say that? If one watches the entire film and considers it in its totality, I believe it's really still an important teaching tool to help students understand and people without a background understand the complexity of this period, especially with the dissolution of the Oslo peace process, as then we move into the post-Gaza occupation phase, essentially of a concentration camp, and then basically stasis up until really October of 2023. So I hope it has served a purpose in this chronological film series in covering this gap between the signing of Oslo and the unilateral disengagement. Our subsequent films will continue on with that narrative, and hopefully for those who found this film problematic, in fact, this is the last of the films that will even show any Israelis or Zionists in a positive light. So if that's our goal, then we've got 4 more films to help account for the damage that was done here by the Junction. So Dr. Muta?
Can I say something quickly? I agree with you. Yeah, we are going to have the chance. And it's not necessarily showing, I would love to see a film about the refuseniks, for example, those Israeli soldiers who refused to serve in the Israeli army. They are shown in a very positive light, but for the good reasons, for the right reasons. I'm not against that. I'm not against humanizing soldiers when they have an awakening, right? When they refuse to do the things that they are to do. And there is actually amazing testimonies online, and there are actually a couple of good films. Maybe we could consider showing them in spring. But I just want to say that I know that Dr. Rahman said the Israeli soldiers he sees now, but I was not referring to the Israeli soldiers as we see them now. I was specifically referring to that period and the periods before and the periods after. Again, there are multiple, I could actually now go online and show you from that specific period, from that attack, there are so many images of Israeli soldiers shooting and harassing and killing Palestinians. So it was an intentional decision on the filmmakers not to show that. That's exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about today. Today is a totally different level of genocide. But that was part of the constant genocide, the ongoing genocide against Palestinians since 1948 until today. It's an ongoing genocide with different forms. Of course, we are shocked at the level it reached, but it never stopped. And I think that's my point. My point is that at that time, that was not the typical behavior of Israeli soldiers. And I think that there was an intention not to show that in the film that I reject. Thank you for allowing me to explain that. And it's okay, we can disagree. We can agree to disagree. That's absolutely fine. That's why we have dialogue and discussions.
I think it's important, really, honestly, to have a nuanced and complex discussion here. I hope people, those that are still with us, have appreciated it. This film, definitely, it's complex and certainly open to criticism. Honestly, just with everything I've said, I cringe every time I watch it during those scenes for the exact reasons like that you laid out perfectly. Nevertheless, I guess it's the historian in me, the two-state solution supporter in me, the guy that drank all that Kool-Aid, despite the fact that colleagues and friends said, don't drink that Kool-Aid, so yeah, it is.
I think I was one of those colleagues because I never believed in the two-state solution.
Yeah, well, and you were right.
For me, it was unfair. Yeah, for me, it was unfair deal from the beginning, even when it's impossible now. I've always thought that, okay, we will be, again, generous enough as Palestinians to accept our colonizers to share the land, but it has to be a totally different new state where everyone has equal rights to live and thrive. We are very far away from that now, especially with the Israeli side, but still we can envision and we can dream of such a future, and you never know, maybe it will happen one day.
I agree, and I would argue that we're actually closer to that than we were before. I think we're much closer, so we will stay tuned. and continue, I say, unfortunately, with our 2024 Witnessing Genocide in Palestine film series, which I just want to add, when putting this series together, we were thinking about the prospect of the film series continuing on after the genocide was over. I think, as everyone is aware, it's going on 24/7 right now by the second. So however horrific that is, or I guess the fact that we're continuing with this film series with a live real-time streaming genocide going on, we will look forward to having as many guests as we can next time, and we'll continue on with our film series, and we'll continue on with the second 2025 version, which we're putting together right now for next term. Hopefully it will not be happening while live real-time genocide is occurring before our eyes. Do my colleagues have any closing thoughts or comments?
Thank you for all your hard labor, Dr. Yagobian.
It's nothing really at all. So thank you both. Sincerely appreciated. Thank you all. We had our largest group of attendees today. So thank you all for sticking around and listening to us. I guess we'll call it a wrap for today and see everyone next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adnan.